like to share with you the story of what Christmas was like at Bob Cratchit's house from A Christmas Carol. And so as we enter, we have Mrs. Cratchit at home with the older Cratchit kids, and Bob's just about to come in.
I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their home familiar carols play, and wild and sweet their words complete, of peace on earth, goodwill to men.
Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for sixpence. And she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and rejoiced to find himself very gallantly attired in newly handed down shirt collars. He yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now the two smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own. And basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onions, these young Cratchits danced about the table and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire. Until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid, to be let out and peeled. "Whatever has got your precious father, then," said Mrs. Cratchit, "and your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha wasn't as late as Christmas Day by half an hour last year." "Here's Martha, Mother," said a girl appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, Mother," said the two young Cratchits. "Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha." "Sit down by the fire," said Mrs. Cratchit. "My dear, you have a warm. Lord bless you." "No, no, there's Father coming," cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking around. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming," said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and had come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only even in a joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim off into the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you've ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in the church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. He healed the sick, the dead he raised, good works were his name be praised." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hardy. His active little crest was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire, while Bob, turning up his cups, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. What a bustle ensued, that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course. And in truth, it was very something like that in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy piping hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table and the two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody. At last, the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it into the breast. But when she did, and when a long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two younger Cratchits, beat upon the table with the handle of his knife, and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness, flavor, its size, and cheapness were themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. And the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onions up to the eyebrows. But now Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witnesses, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody had gotten over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose. But alas, there was a great deal of steam, a smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house, and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed, but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quadrant of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, what a wonderful pudding. Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest accomplishment achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for so large a family. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug was being tasted, and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put on the table. And a shovelful of chestnuts were thrown onto the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth, in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one. And Bob served out the hot stuff from the jug, with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. And Bob proposed. A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us, which all the family re-echoed. God bless us, everyone, said Tiny Tim the waterfall. Ding dong merrily on high, in heaven the bells are ringing. Ding dong merrily the sky is ridden with angels singing. Gloria, Hosanna in excelsis. Gloria, Hosanna